and viewers around the world to the Enlightenment podcast. We have lots to talk about in general, and especially at this time, we feel that it's very important to have a dialogue on Palestine. This is our season one, to build awareness, to give some context, and to reach as many people as possible. Exciting today news that we have a guest speaker, and that is Victor Kattan, who is Hanan's cousin.
And hi, Victor.
Hi,
Shreem and I
hi.
are excited to have you join us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And Victor is not only here because he's Hanan's cousin, he is actually an extremely accomplished person and legal professor. He's actually an assistant professor in public international law at the University of Nottingham School of Law. He's a former legal advisor to the Palestinian Negotiation Affairs Department in Ramallah. He's a member of the editorial board of the Asian Journal of International Law and an area editor for the Middle East and Islam for the Oxford Bibliographies of International Law. So international law is his thing. His publications are too many to mention here. I'll mention an edited book called Making Endless War, the Vietnam and Arab-Israeli Conflicts in the History of International Law. And he's also the editor of The Breakup of India and Palestine, The Causes and Legacies of Partition, and many, many more publications. We'll put the details of Victor's website and socials into the show notes so you can follow up if you'd like to. Dr. Kattan's scholarship has been cited by the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, judges at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, by various states and international organizations, and in advisory proceedings before the ICJ, before the special rapporteurs to the UN Human Rights Council, and leading academics. Victor is also an associate member of the Temple Garden Chambers in London. Amazing credentials. Let me ask, first of all, I'm going to throw a left field question. Hanan, how are you related to Victor?
So that's a bit confusing. So the Kattans from Bethlehem are all related somehow, one way or the other. So my grandfather Tufi and his sister Margot from one side of the Kattans, and from the other side there's Victor Kattan, who is my cousin Victor's grandfather, and his sister, also called Margot, married. So two brothers, two sisters married each other. So Tufi, my grandfather, married Margot, and Victor's sister, and Victor married my grandfather's sister, if you like, also called Margot. So basically, we are related on both sides of the grandparents, and we're second cousins.
Les deux Margot, quite a saga. I wish. I'm almost sorry I asked, and maybe we'll come back and do that in another podcast. How everybody's related to each other, but. Let's move on. Victor, let me start by asking you to share a little bit about your family's diaspora story about Palestine. Ideally, leaving out any grandmothers called Margot. How has their diaspora story shaped your identity and your work?
Well, Margot is an important part of the story, so
Okay.
yeah. No, well, I should start by saying that I am my father's Palestinian, my mum's English. So my life has been largely shaped by my father's experience. So Margot, my grandmother, moved to the Sudan in the 1930s, and they were merchants there for many years. And my grandparents lived there, and I was born there. And I moved a lot as a young child, following my father around South Pacific Islands, the West Indies, but mainly British boarding schools or a school. So I guess my diaspora experience has been shaped by my father's side of the family, by the stories he told me, by meeting my family, my cousins, trips back to Palestine. There was a branch of the family who actually immigrated from Palestine to Manchester, and they've been here for almost a century. So there has been a tradition. And my father went to boarding schools, also in the UK in the 1960s. And he went to university here, and that's how he met my mother. So yeah.
And Victor, what was your earliest exposure to the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and how was it presented within your family?
So, I mean, I think the first time I recall hearing about or being cognizant, I should say, about the conflict was when I was quite young, and maybe I was about 12 years old, and it came on the radio. My father was driving to see, I think, my grandmother actually in London, and it was the Israeli elections, I think in 1992, Labour government. And I remember my dad saying something like he was hopeful that there was some optimism at that time that this might lead to peace negotiations. At that time it was the end of the Cold War, and I think that was the start of the so-called Oslo process, when at that time there was a bit more optimism. And as a result of that, actually, as a result of Oslo, I think we forget now, we criticize it. My grandmother and my father were able to visit Bethlehem for the first time since 1967. It wasn't easy to visit. Remember, it was part of Jordan between 48 and 67, and it was under occupation, and it was not easy. It was not easy to visit after 1994. And so that comes to when I first went to visit the family in Bethlehem. So that was in 96. And it was quite an experience for me to see, in those days, even the Israeli army is obviously still there, but they were, even at the airport, now it's all private security checkpoints, but even at the airport you had soldiers in full combat gear going through your luggage and opening your boots, and having my mum step out of the car and asking her questions. So we were there, and my dad, the reason we went to Palestine is my dad had a job as a United Nations World Health Organization, actually in Gaza at the time.
Yeah.
We didn't travel to Gaza, so he would travel to Gaza, and he was able to do that and come back to Bethlehem in those days. Believe it or not, it's impossible today. And we spent a week with the family for the first visit we did. And it was also unusual. I remember going to Jaffa, Tel Aviv on that trip in a Palestinian taxi, those old yellow Mercedes-Benz taxis with green number plates. We actually were able to drive it from Bethlehem to Tel Aviv. We got a lot of odd looks from people, Israelis at the time, but it was possible to do if you had the right permit, if you had the right ID, which this particular driver did. You could actually make that journey, which of course has become impossible now. Mm-hmm. But I also remember the checkpoints. We did a trip to Hebron on that visit, where we went to the mosque where there was been the killing by Baruch Goldstein, and there were pictures and photographs. So that's quite shocking to see, and having to go through Israeli security, extra security to get into the mosque, and seeing very religious, right-wing Zionist settlement nearby. So that was quite, that was something to behold. And then I guess hearing the stories from my cousins, my aunties, about what life was like there. I was 16 at the time, so I was very influenced, by what I saw and experienced. And I remember going back to boarding school and wanting to read as much as I could about the conflict. In those days, it was still the old, reading newspapers in the school library. So that's when I think I became really interested in what was going on and wanting to learn more. And I subsequently did more visits to see the family, work there during the Intifada, the second Intifada, and then became an academic scholar, also as a journalist as well for a period before I went into academia. So that's a long way of answering your question.
No, but it's really good. I love that detail. So when you think about what impacted, you came back and you wanted to learn more about the conflict. Was it, do you think, knowing that you now had family who were so rooted there and that you'd met them, or was it a fact that you come at 16 years old and you're having to pass through checkpoints or have the right permits and see people who are in essence living in a sort of apartheid-y kind of a world? Do you think it was either of those or both of them, or
both? I think both. I mean, I think because I've been to other places where there's been similar. I've been to Kashmir, for instance, Indian-occupied Kashmir. I've seen even more soldiers. I mean, the sheer volume of soldiers the government of India has, because they have so many more people, was quite shocking. And I stayed there. But I guess the difference for me is I'm half Palestinian, so it's my family that's directly affected. So it's more emotional for me. more personal for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Victor, for those who don't know about Palestinian history or find it too complicated, we hear that all the time, people saying, oh, I don't understand, it's too complex. Could you kind of summarize it in a everyday person, a layman speaking, kind of to help them understand it? Not to academics and to lawyers and so on, but just everyday people.
Well, I can give an example. It's not a perfect example, but it might be a way of trying to explain to British citizens or the people in the UK who are not familiar with the conflict. Let's say the UK was colonized by another country, and then in the process of colonizing the UK, they declared that they were going to establish a state for another population entirely. And they were going to encourage the mass migration of people of that community into the UK with a view to changing the identity of the state from the United Kingdom to another country, another state, another religious group. And then over a number of years, during that colonial period where you have no rights to vote, no rights to you basically all your political and civil rights are restricted in that situation. By this foreign power. There is a conflict because obviously the British people aren't happy that all these immigrants are coming into the country with the view to taking it over. There's a war and they lose that conflict, so they flee, and the immigrant community is able to acquire territory and declare a state. That's how you could say the conflict began. You become refugees in your own country, or you flee to other countries. I mean, it's more complex a little bit perhaps than that. But I guess in essence, that's one way to try to understand it.
I think that's really great, actually, because it also brings the notion of what's going on really close to home. And I think it's very easy for people to just kind of assume that it's all happening somewhere else and we don't have to think about it in those terms. So thank you. But going back to that, talking about the very beginning, this establishment of Israel and this decision by the UN to partition Palestine back in 1947. The Palestinians and the Arabs didn't agree to this, correct? The UN still voted to give 56% of Palestine to the Zionists to create a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state. Is that even legal to give away somebody's land, or is it okay because for some reason, technically, because it's the UN saying it?
So, first of all, it was only a recommendation. So it was to understand the United Nations partition plan, we have to understand what happened before. So Palestine was a League of Nations mandate. During that period, the British government encouraged the immigration of Jews to Palestine against without the consent of the Palestinians, who were opposed to that. Then by the end of the mandate period, you have a substantial Jewish population. They're still a minority of the population. They're still a minority, vast majority of landowners. Most of the land remains in private Palestinian ownership. Then you have the Second World War, you have the Holocaust, and then the UN is considering what to do. The UK announces they're going to leave. They decided that they're fed up. There was terrorist acts against the British, against the British from the Jewish groups. And UK was bankrupt, a whole bunch of reasons why they decided to leave, and they left in a rush. But before they left, they basically asked the United Nations to propose solutions. Because, who's going to take over? They promised to create a Jewish state or Jewish homeland. At the same time, they promised the Palestinian self-determination, self-government. So the United Nations is given this problem, and they have various commissions to go and study it. You have a majority and a minority commission. The majority view was that the Palestinian national ambitions and Zionist aspirations were incompatible. And therefore, it wasn't a good solution, but it was better than no solution. That was to have a partition of the land. The minority view said, no, the Palestinians are the indigenous majority. It's democracy entails that they determine their future destiny. The Jews must be contented to live as a minority community with all the civil and political rights that minorities have in an independent Palestinian state. But anyhow, the majority report was the one that made its way to the vote, and a very slim majority of states voted to partition Palestine. All the Arab states that were then members of the United Nations were voted against it, as did India and Pakistan. Interestingly, they both voted against the partition plan.
Yeah, having been through a partition themselves, probably.
Partition themselves.
Yeah.
And although that's still interesting because, of course, Muslim League supported the partition of India, but I voted against it in Palestine for reasons I could go into. I wrote a whole book. I edited a whole book on that. But so the vote was a recommendation to divide the land. The land was more generous to the Jewish state. Part of that was because those advocating the partition plan were linking a solution to the Jewish refugee problem in Europe to Palestine. So they said that although Jews were a minority, over time they were envisaging immigration from Europe, from the camps, not to the United States, Canada, Australia, where they had lots of lands and civil liberties, but to Palestine, which was a war zone. You can make of that what you will. But that was one of the reasons why the plan was more generous to the Jewish state than it was to the Palestinian states.
Yeah.
And also in 1967, when Israel invaded and illegally took over the remainder of Palestine, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Golan Heights, Syria, Gaza, and basically the area. But whenever people talk about the 1967 border and they discuss a two-state solution, they always omit the fact that in 1948, even though the Zionists were given 56% of the land, they end up taking 78% of Palestine. So that 22% that they took over and above, why is that never proposed or on the table for a two-state solution?
Well, I think it's still open, to be honest, because if you look closely at UN resolutions, they don't actually refer to the 1967. Well, some of them do, but some of the more recent ones refer to what they call the pre-1967 lines, i.e. the lines that existed before then. And so this is ambiguous. It could mean one of two things. It could mean the 1949 ceasefire lines, which is what you're referring to. Yeah. Or it could refer to the partition plan lines, which would be a greater part of territory. So it would be it wouldn't include the territory Israel conquered and annexed in 1948. So what happened in 1947 is the UN proposed these two states with these borders, but then there was armed conflict broke out, and as a result of that conflict, Israel was able to acquire more territory than the partition plan lines had granted it. And they held on to that territory until the 1967 war, and then they expanded to include all the other territories. But you could make the argument that if a two-state solution, a negotiated two-state solution, the borders don't have to necessarily follow the 1949 ceasefire lines, but should also include. The argument could be made. I don't know if it has been made, but it could fall closer to the lines that were proposed in 1947. But we're a long way from that because no one's even talking about.
I know.
The border anymore. I mean, the Netanyahu government that wants the entire. I mean, not just his government, successive Likud government since 1977. Want sovereignty and basically are exercising sovereignty over all of the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River.
Mm. And what does that mean for the people who are there, who are not Israeli, who qualify as Palestinian? We talked about apartheid and Israel being an apartheid state in our last podcast. My parents are from South Africa. As you know, they eventually left in the 60s because of apartheid to come to the UK. So, but I've heard some people say, oh, no, and what happens in Israel is not apartheid. So how do you explain this concept of Israeli apartheid to those who are unfamiliar with it? And can you clarify apartheid against the Palestinians of 1948 who remain in in Israel as citizens versus the discrimination against Palestinians who are currently in occupied West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem?
Well, the current Israeli government, as I mentioned, successive Likud governments have claimed all of the territory to belong to Israel, but the current government is the most explicit about this, and their coalition agreement makes it clear that they claim sovereignty. Not just that they claim that they are going to exercise sovereignty over all of the land of Israel, which they specifically define as including Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights and East Jerusalem, etc. And not only that, but they have recently established a settlement administration, a new government unit within the civil administration, within the military structure of the West Bank, for the exclusive interests of the settlers, who can actually make now that body can also issue its own regulations. They've already been doing this for years anyway. The Knesset laws extend to Israeli Jews. In fact, they extend to anyone who's Jewish under the law of return, so they don't even need to be Israeli citizens. It extends wherever they may live. So not just inside Israel, but also in the West Bank.
Oh, wow.
At the same time, the Palestinians are not subject to the same rights. Palestinians in the West Bank are not entitled to the same rights as Israeli citizens. So they are directly discriminated against in every conceivable sphere. Not only can they not vote, I'm talking about West Bank Palestinians, so I'll come back to the Israeli citizens later. They cannot vote for the Knesset because they're occupied. They cannot vote or choose the military commanders who exercise authority over them because it's an authoritarian. I mean, basically the way it's structured is that the military determines the laws, military orders. It determines the military judges, and it executes. So it's in charge of executing all of this. The Palestinian Authority is more like a grand local council under the military authority. So the real sovereign, the real power is the military. Then you have Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. Yeah. Even when it comes to issuing travel permits or IDs, every single ID document that's issued in the West Bank is issued by the Israeli Ministry of the Interior. Even for the president, even if travel permits are issued by special military units. So even the president wants to go overseas or go from Ramallah to Jerusalem, he needs a travel permit. So it's clear that authoritarian military structure is the one that de facto is illegal, it's unlawful, as the ICJ has declared, but it's the one that continues to exist, continues to determine and affect people's lives. You have direct discrimination, legislatively, administratively, between Israelis who are Israeli Jews, whether under the law of return, who have Israeli ID cards, let's say, and Palestinians who have a different ID card. You have discrimination across a whole range of regulations, and then you have the domination, and you have all the inhumane acts which are under international law. It's defined as a series of inhumane acts in a system of discrimination and domination, and it's systematic. It's ongoing. It's been coming for decade after decade. I won't go through all the inhuman acts, the killings, torture, arbitrary detention, etc. Even in the most extreme case, genocide, and these are all listed as examples in the International Convention on Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. A similar definition appears in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So you have all the elements there. Now, Palestinian citizens of Israel are slightly different because they can vote for members of the legislature, the Knesset, but they're a minority of 20%. And even despite that, there are restrictions on the kind of political parties that can exist. They can't challenge for example, the notion that Israel is a state for the Jewish people. So they are limited in what they can do and what they can say. Increasingly, since the war in Gaza, they've been subject to draconian legislation. For example, if they're seen as expressing solidarity or sympathy with Palestinians in Gaza, they can be detained. But also I think it's false to try and think so. It's because of the way Israel is ruling the territories. It's ruling all of the territories. So in a way, we can speak of Palestinians existing in different domains. Citizens of Israel who have more rights than the other Palestinians, citizens of East Jerusalem who have not, sorry, they're not citizens, they're permanent residents, Palestinians of East Jerusalem, who don't have as much rights as Palestinian citizens of Israel, but they have more rights than Palestinians of the West Bank or Gaza. And then there are the refugees. It's not so different to apartheid South Africa when you think that those who had the most rights are the white persons. Then there were the colored community, who are kind of like second in the pyramid. And then you had the so-called natives, the natives at the bottom who had the least rights. And the way in which in South Africa you had restrictions on the dumb pass, was it called? The pass you had to show everyone when you traveled.
Yeah.
They have the same similar thing in Israel. So I guess it's a military as opposed to the civil administration, whatever you called it in South Africa. So nothing's identical. Like a crime of genocide isn't identical to what happened in the Holocaust. There are different types, like in Rwanda. Now it's being argued it's happening in Gaza, and in different. The claim was also made with regard to events in during the wars in the former Yugoslavia. So a crime that's defined in international law might be inspired by events that occurred in a specific place. So the crime of genocide was inspired by what happened in Europe in the Second World War, and the crime of apartheid was inspired by or influenced by what happened in Southern Africa, South Africa especially. But when lawyers try to define it, they try to define the crime so that it's broadly applicable anywhere else that has similar characteristics. And so that's in the context in which the argument that Israel's practicing apartheid exists. So it's made. But there are of course differences of view depending on whether you make this distinction between the West Bank and Israel. But because of what the current Israeli government especially has been doing, and because they are the Knesset is encroaching, and the basic law they passed in 2018, the nation state law, for example, which determines that only the Jewish people have an exclusive right to self-determination in the land of Israel, it's increasingly looking like the whole entity is discriminatory. But people will agree to disagree on that. But that's why I think more and more people are making that claim.
Yeah. And do you think, because we've seen them ignore again and again the international rules and regulations and everything that keeps passing, so do you feel, Victor, that if the international system is not able to implement these rulings, is international law effective, and what is the solution long term? Because if it keeps being ignored and more crimes are being committed.
So international law is a consent-based system. So it's not automatically, it's not self-executing, let's say, in most places. And it has weak enforcement machinery because it depends on the political organs of the United Nations, the most important one being the UN Security Council, which has been divided for at least the last 10 years and was divided for most of the Cold War. So it's a weak system to rely on. Having said that, certain institutions were established to try to, which are also weak, but like the International Criminal Court, which tries to, prosecute senior political leaders for the most heinous crimes. But again, it depends on cooperation amongst states. So as long as we don't have that cooperation, it's a problem. But in terms of the actual rules, Israel, the International Court of Justice found Israel's occupation to be unlawful, found a breach of the prohibition of racial segregation and apartheid. So even the ICJ now has come around to holding that view. But the problem we have, I think, is that the great powers themselves are increasingly misbehaving. Whether it's the Russians in Ukraine or whether it's what Morocco, for example, is doing in Western Sahara, annexing the territory, the former Spanish colony of Spanish Sahara, now Western Sahara, and its recognition by the Americans, the Israelis, and now the French government. So this is a problem. We have rules that are clear. You can't get a clearer rule than the prohibition on the use of force and the prohibition of annexation. And we have everyone, the Americans, of course, in Iraq, invading Iraq in 2003. So we increasingly have, and this is a problem, we have great powers who are stretching and breaching the rules that they themselves had agreed to after the Second World War. So it's actually a very dangerous situation. And the Palestine situation, I guess, is caught up in that, where the law is clear, the breaches are clear, but the enforcement is increasingly difficult. And we can see that even with the current conflict in Gaza and Lebanon and broader, where the Western powers are seeing it as a geopolitical conflict between Iran and the so-called axis of evil and Israel, and they're increasingly aligning themselves with Israel in this struggle. There have been for a while. Even the Arab states are you know, they won't openly side with Israel, but aren't you know, are not on the same side when it comes to Iran. So it's the law. It in that kind of complex environment, it's not effective because you don't have the cooperation from the states who you would expect to enforce the rules. And if they're not willing, then the problem is they're not willing to, so far, to take more determined action against the Israelis. We have seen some states restrict the export of weapons or new licenses, but they haven't done enough. There should, in my view, be a full arms embargo. There should be a UN Security Council resolution, but that's not happening. But you know, you have to make the argument for it's incumbent on Palestinians to make the argument for why it's important to do that, and why it's important to uphold, despite all these challenges, some kind of, I don't like the world rules-based order because it's been abused by Washington, but some kind of international order, because otherwise the opposite is chaos. Yeah. It can't really benefit anyone.
Yeah, exactly. So then, with that in mind, let's think about potential solutions. How has your legal expertise influenced your views about potential solutions?
Right now, I'm not thinking about solutions because they're so far removed. Just thinking about I'm prosecuting senior Israelis for crimes they've gotten away with for so many years. I mean, the I suppose the mainstream, or once upon a time, the mainstream view was always this idea of having two states. And one reason for that view was not because it was seen as more just or more fair or more equitable, but it was seen as more realistic. Because if you want to have the Palestinians governing the areas, I mean, the idea was that you couldn't get the Palestinians and Israelis to agree in a one state. If it was going to be a democratic state, how would you get... Let's play that idea, a one-state solution with a legislature that represents the entire territory. How would you have members of Hamas, Fatah, Islamic Jihad, let's say, sitting down with Jewish Power Party, the Likud, and the other? They would never agree to do anything. You'd have chaos. So the idea was that in a representative system where you have two national groups who have completely diametrically opposed views of what they want to do. The idea is you have a partition. This is the same in India, by the way. India, this was the argument of the Muslim League. One of the arguments. They didn't favor. They favored the two-nation theory, but not the partition as it was imposed upon them. But some of the arguments that they were articulating is that in a unitary Indian state, it would be dominated by the Hindu majority, and the Muslim League wouldn't be able. That's the argument they made. They wouldn't. They feared their rights, their national rights, wouldn't be respected. They preferred a federal arrangement. In Israel, Palestine, of course, it's much smaller population, much smaller territory, and there's more right now. There's parity between the two. Well, according to the latest figures I've seen, there might be more Palestinians than there are Jews between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. But the point is that you're unlikely to get agreement in a democratic system where everyone has the same right, where every person has a right to vote. It wouldn't function well. It wouldn't function, the democratic system wouldn't function so well in that system. Hence, you try to divide the territory and create, this is a partition plan as well, by the way, the idea behind it, where you have a majority, at least a clearer majority of Jews in one side and a clearer majority of Palestinians on the other side, and then the representative democracy can work better. Of course, if you have a dictatorship or a communist party system, it doesn't really matter then. right? You'd have one ruler, one party would be in charge of the territory, and they would decide what's in the best interests of the greater good, if you like. So there's a very long-winded way of trying to answer your question, but it's not clear. I'm not sure it's helpful. I was speaking to a Palestinian friend last night, and his answer is a professor at SOAS. He's like, this debate isn't even helpful right now. So maybe that's probably the easier answer.
Yeah, I don't know. From my perspective, I think the two-state solution is so dead because, well, with almost 1 million settlers, with the way they've constructed the Bantustan and all the different divisions, and it's sort of, again, the apartheid. I believe there should be one equal vote, equal rights for each person. I know that's not something they'll ever accept, but Victor, what are your thoughts on the kind of the significant changes that you've been noticing on the international perception of the conflict over the years? Because I know you're quite involved in that. Have you seen any sort of positive potential progress, or do you think it's just so far out that there's no option?
I mean, in terms of the language that's used to describe Israel's actions, there's certainly been a big shift in the kind of discourse. A lot of more references to colonialism, to apartheid, to domination, even to genocide now, which are really extreme crimes. And the fact that these are being adjudicated at the International Court of Justice is not a good thing, obviously, but at the same time, it shows that the level of violence and atrocities that are being committed by Israel, the fact that they can even be compared to these crimes, is a massive change to what was facing the court 20 years ago, when it was about the construction of a wall in the West Bank, whether that was lawful. So we are seeing much more. The language has certainly changed, and the question is whether the policy will change as a result, and maybe it will. I mean, let me maybe answer that question by talking about apartheid again, because I remember, you couldn't use the word apartheid. I remember participating in a debate at the University of Birmingham. What year would it have been? I think it was the year 2011. And I wanted to raise this issue of apartheid, and the chairwoman said to me, "You can't use that word."
Oh, wow.
You can't use the word. I'm not allowing you to use the word. So I said, all right, my whole presentation was going to be on apartheid. So I said, all right, I'm not going to change my presentation. I'll use the letter A. Every time I refer to apartheid, I'll say A. It was ridiculous. But now no one really, I think no one even, now we're talking about genocide. Forget about apartheid, we've moved on. But it was so I was involved in a study funded by the South African government back in 2008, 2009 on apartheid. We went to South Africa and we studied the system there, and we thought there were parallels. We published a report and it became a book. Then other UN special rapporteurs were also making the comparison or making the claim. It was even mentioned in this famous UN report by a scholar called Virginia Tilley and Richard Falk. I don't know if you remember this. In 2017, it was a Jordanian diplomat who commissioned it, Rima Khalef, maybe.
Okay.
And it was the United Nations Commission for Western Asia, and they published this report basically describing Israel's policies of apartheid. And the United Nations Secretary General forced them to delete the report from the website. Did you remember that story?
Yeah, my God.
Right. And then she resigned. She resigned because she was disgusted with what the UN. All right. And then the following year, the Israeli Knesset passed a nation-state law saying only the Jewish people have an exclusive right to self-determination in the land of Israel. Then suddenly everyone's like, "Oh my God, this is apartheid!" Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then 3 years later, or 2 years later, a bunch of Israeli NGOs, I think B'Tselem and Yesh Din, published reports saying, the situation in the West Bank is apartheid. And then Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch then published studies saying, no, the whole thing is apartheid. Or there was a bit of divisions on does it include just the West Bank or Israel proper? And the difference. But the point is that despite these little minor differences, the language was being endorsed. And now during the recent advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice, about 25 states also made the argument, and then it's briefly mentioned in the advisory opinion. The court preferred to use this expression systemic discrimination rather than apartheid. But in finding a breach of Article 3 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, they essentially are saying it's apartheid.
Yeah.
It refers to segregation and apartheid. So we're seeing over time the language change. What we're not seeing yet, or we've seen, I mean, we have seen, as I mentioned, some restrictions on weapons, boycotts and divestment. Civil society definitely has been very active. The EU, I think the UK, have come out and sanctioned leaders of the settler parties or some individuals, settlers. So it's not enough. It's too small, but there is this, and the amount of deaths that had to, destruction of property and killings, for them to move in such small things is still disturbing.
Yeah.
And our politicians are still, saying very silly things.
Yeah, for sure.
I was it David Lammy came out and was upset that someone had referred to Israel's actions as tantamount to genocide. I don't know if you saw that.
No.
Which is so that only the Jewish Holocaust was genocide, which is again. So there's a long uphill battle still to influence our policymakers. Much work still needs to be done in that regard.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, okay, genocide, apartheid, all these things are now being talked about, finally, unfortunately, but finally. Is there something that in the Palestinian experience that you still feel is not being, the international community is not aware of? What's an underreported thing that's going on in your experience?
That's a good question. I mean, the one thing I'd say about the conflict is it's one of the most widely reported in the world, so they can't really hide behind ignorance. They have people on the ground, whether it's they're diplomats or they're officials who work for various agencies, so that they are aware. I mean, to me, it's still shocking that we have no independent journalists. I mean, non-Palestinian journalists, Western journalists in Gaza.
Yeah.
And that's not. I mean, sometimes you increasingly see it. Fergal Keane has been doing fantastic work on the BBC website, and he's been mentioning specifically this case, but you don't always hear it from the other newspapers, such as the Telegraph, which has taken a very pro-Israel view. But what they don't know, then I think they don't know. Maybe they don't study Palestinian society in enough detail. Relations between Palestinians, but maybe their knowledge of, I think, but I do think that it's something that is studied probably more than any other part of the world. So nothing's jumping at me right now. That remains understudied, if I'm honest. Whether they want to listen to what the advice they're being given is another thing. There may be resistance to what they're being told. I suspect there is.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it is shocking about the journalists not being allowed in throughout the whole.
Or humanitarian aid as well, of course.
Yeah, completely. It's really complete censorship. And Victor, I mean, how do you maintain hope and basically with the genocide and
what makes you think I maintain hope?
I don't know, or do you maintain hope with this?
I'm
with your work, how do you stay motivated?
Okay, that's a different question.
Okay.
You can be motivated even if you're in total despair. I guess I must have some hope inside me, otherwise I wouldn't do any of this work. Hope that what I write and what I do will make a difference, although I'm increasingly wondering whether that's the case at all. I don't know. I guess I've done so much work on it already. I know I've got so much knowledge. I need to keep at it, I guess.
Yeah, I think important. Yeah, very important. I know it's disheartening.
Yeah.
And then from my perspective, like, what does Palestine mean to you personally? Because I think we all have different feelings about it. And what motivates you to keep doing what you're doing despite everything?
I guess my identity, the fact my father's Palestinian, my family's from there, they have a rich history, you know, the stories I grew up with as a child, the photographs that we have, even some videos still of life there. The books, the literature, the food, the fact that we still have family there, knowledge of the history, knowledge of the injustice. It's not something that happened on October, that began on the 7th of October, but we know that we know what's happened stretches, almost 100 years now or more. So having all that knowledge and passion, I guess, for hoping, despite all the odds, that at some point there will be a better outcome for everyone, I guess is what drives me. Yeah.
And you're doing it wonderfully. Please keep it up.
Exactly. Is there anything specific that you're working on right now that you could share with us, or that you're particularly interested or excited about?
Some of the work I can't mention.
Okay, well,
I guess my bigger project is a book project on apartheid as a crime against humanity. I have a contract with Oxford University Press, but I don't seem to have the time to write it because I'm being asked to do other things. But that the idea of that book is to come up with like the definitive study on apartheid as a crime, which can be applied to anywhere. So the idea is it will obviously be relevant to what's happening in the Middle East, but it could also apply to other countries that adopt institutionalized systems of discrimination and mass killings, oppression, etc. So that's my current big project. I'm working on other smaller projects on Western Sahara. I got a grant to work on that. What Morocco is actually doing is not that different to what the Israelis are doing. I think it doesn't get the light, the limelight, or because of the level. It's a much smaller. I mean, we're talking much smaller population, mostly in the desert territories, without the spectacular violence, I suppose, that attracts people. And the Western Sahara is seen as a kind of exotic, far away region, even though it's actually closer to parts of Europe and Israel, Palestine. But it being the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, it attracts more light, more attention than the other places. So I'm doing that. I do the odd consultancies here and there. Yeah.
Okay, great. And we'll, as I say, I guess your website or your social media is the best place for people to find you.
I mean, I have a university webpage where I can contact it on social media handles as well.
Great. So Google Victor Kattan for more information, I guess. But Victor, thank you so much. It's been really, really illuminating, I think. Because Hanan and I tend to talk in very broad strokes on this podcast, so it's lovely to hear somebody who's got quite a specific knowledge. If you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe. Please do share with your friends and family. It really helps us spread the word. And our aim is to bring our point of view of humanism to as many people as possible with your support.
And as always, we believe that stories matter and representation matters. And just to say thank you to my cousin Victor Kattan for this really valuable insight today. And thank you for taking the time to watch. Please remember to like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode.
Thanks. Thank you, Hanan and Shameen.
Thank you.